We start this morning, though, with the news that former President Donald Trump has been found liable for sexually abusing and defaming the writer E. Jean Carroll.
He was not found liable for raping her. Trump was ordered to pay Carroll $5 million in damages after a jury took just 3 hours to reach its verdict. Carroll's court victory comes 4 years after she first made the allegation that Trump raped her in a department store dressing room in the mid-90s. It's an allegation that the former president has repeatedly denied. Here to break down the verdict and what it means for Trump's future is NBC News correspondent Ron Allen, along with NBC News legal analyst Kristen Gibbons-Fedden. Kristen, let's start with you. Help us understand the jury's verdict here, which was reached in about 3 hours. How do you think they came to this decision? And that figure of $5 million, how was that calculated?
Well, they found Trump liable. They really believed what Jeannie Carroll was saying, and they looked at the mountain of evidence and found liability. Now, as you pointed out, they did not find him liable for the rape. So there was obviously some deliberations around the insufficiency of the plaintiff's burden, that they did not find that there was penetration in the way that the judge had described it.
All right, John, again back with something worth your time. When faced with mounting pressure, legal consequences, or pointed questions, Trump follows a predictable sequence: an adverse moment, a verbal attack on whoever is applying the pressure, and then a physical exit from the accountability setting. The pattern is documented and repeating, revealing not isolated outbursts, but a systematic refusal to face scrutiny. Start with the courtroom. January 2024, the E. Jean Carroll damages trial. This is a proceeding where a jury has already found Trump liable for sexual abuse and defamation. Now they are deliberating on how much he must pay for continuing to defame his accuser even after the first verdict. The closing arguments are underway when Carroll's lawyer stands before the jury and delivers a devastating summation.
But that there was forcible sexual contact made with Jean Carroll by Trump without her consent. Now, the jury, when they come up with an award such as $5 million, they consider several factors: her loss of income, the damage to her reputation. And in this case, the jury did make a finding for punitive damages. That means that they found that Trump's conduct with regard to the sex abuse as well as the defamation was willful and malicious and with conscious disregard for Jeannie Carroll. But I think as a civil litigator, I think that the most important part was they really considered the emotional distress and the psychological pain. So though we don't know what the jury actually used to devise this figure, I'd go ahead and bet that it's really the emotional distress and the psychological pain that she testified to experiencing.
Ron is on set here with us. Let's bring you in here, Ron. And I want to talk about some of the reaction. We'll pull up a statement released by E. Jean Carroll. It read, in part, "I filed this lawsuit against Donald Trump to clear my name and get my life back. Today, the world finally knows the truth." And then on the other side of this, in addition to releasing a statement through a campaign spokesperson,
he tells those 12 jurors that Trump has persistently lied, that he has conducted himself as though the laws simply do not apply to him, and that they should punish him accordingly. It is the moment of maximum accountability in the entire proceeding. The precise instant when the consequences of Trump's conduct are being laid out for the people who will decide his financial fate. And what happens in that exact moment? Trump rises from his seat and walks out of the courtroom. Not during routine testimony, not during a procedural sidebar, during closing arguments. During the specific moment when a lawyer is making the case to jurors about what his conduct means and what the consequences should be.
Donald Trump posted this statement on his Truth Social platform, where he continued to state that he did not know who Carroll is and called the verdict a disgrace. Ron, tell us more about both sides' reaction to this verdict.
Well, they both reacted in what they said on the witness stand or in court. E. Jean Carroll appeared for several days. It was a very emotional time, 2 days of cross-examination, which at times was very aggressive by former President Trump's attorneys. Former President Trump did not appear in person, but he appeared in the deposition that he did last fall, where he basically says he doesn't know her, this is a disgrace, it's a hoax, so on and so forth. But he also appeared in an Access Hollywood tape, which we've all seen. And the E. Jean Carroll's attorney said basically that that was his confession to this particular allegation. Afterwards, Joe Tacopino, Trump's attorney, also reacted. Here's some of what he had to say.
He's firm in his belief, as many people are, that he cannot get a fair trial in New York City. based on the jury pool. And I think one could argue that that's probably an accurate assessment based on what happened today.
Judge Lewis Kaplan, the presiding judge, calmly notes it for the official record. Mr. Trump just rose and walked out of the courtroom. Reporters in the room describe an audible gasp from observers. The Secret Service follows him out. Sky News covers it. The visual is unmistakable. A defendant literally walking away from the very proceeding that is about to hold him accountable. Now, pause and consider what that exit represents. A defendant who leaves during closing arguments is a defendant who is not present to hear the jury being asked to make findings about his conduct. He is not there for the moment when the case against him is summarized in its most powerful form. Whether that departure has any legal consequence is almost beside the point.
Throughout cross-examination, Tacopino tried to tell the jury that E. Jean Carroll and her friends were politically motivated. They did not like Donald Trump, to put it mildly. And that's what they said was their motivation. But obviously, the jury didn't buy it.
So, Kristen, obviously Trump's lawyer there plans to appeal this decision. What does that process look like when we're dealing with a civil case? What would be the arguments, the legal grounds here?
So they would probably petition or file a motion for turning the verdict over. In other words, asking the judge to step into the shoes of the jury and overturn that verdict. I can't imagine that will be granted. They'll then go to the higher courts. And I think some of the grounds that they'll probably raise will be the use of the deposition footage because it was really damaging, and specifically the portions that were permitted by Judge Kaplan to be utilized. They may also seek other evidentiary findings that Judge Kaplan permitted, such as permission to allow those other women to testify about how Trump also sexually abused them. There was also the mistrial that was made, motion that was made in the middle of the trial. And so the denial of that mistrial and the grounds for that.
The behavioral meaning is visible and specific. At the precise moment when accountability pressure reaches its peak, he physically removes himself from the room. But here is where it gets interesting. This was not an isolated incident. The sequence repeated itself in another New York courtroom, the civil fraud trial, the one where Trump and his organization were accused of systematically inflating asset values to secure favorable loan terms. The proceedings had been dragging on for weeks when Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer and fixer, delivered testimony that the judge found credible. Cohen's testimony had cut deep, exposing the internal mechanics of the fraud scheme.
Will also probably be the purpose of their appeal as well. And I think overall, Tacopino had said that the judge was treating him unfairly, and so they'll also look at that as well.
Ron, this is the first time that a former president has been found civilly liable of sexual misconduct, but he's not just a former president, he's a candidate again. We're getting any clues about what this means for the election?
Well, we'll see. It's not just this, and it is pretty monumental. We say this sort of matter-of-factly, a former president found liable for sexual assault, but that is pretty intense when you think about what's happened here. And but it's not just this case. There's a criminal case that Donald Trump faces in New York City. There's another civil case where he's accused of basically fraudulent business practices. There's the Georgia case involving tampering with the election, allegedly. There's the special prosecutors looking at January 6th. And the question is, over the coming weeks and months, whether the weight of that, all of that, will shift the political dynamic. I think people feel very strongly one way or another about former President Trump. And whether all of this moves the needle in one way or another will determine how 2024 plays out. And
after Cohen stepped down, Trump's legal team made a dramatic motion to dismiss the case entirely. They argued that the evidence simply was not there, that the case should be thrown out. Judge Arthur Engoron heard the arguments, considered the record, and made a decision. He refused to dismiss the case. The evidence was sufficient, the judge determined, and the trial would continue. What happened next is documented by Courthouse News. A dramatic shouting match erupted between the lawyers. Voices were raised, tempers flared. The tension in the courtroom became almost unbearable. And then, in the middle of this escalating confrontation, Trump stood up and walked out, the pattern holding perfectly. An adverse legal moment produces a physical departure from the accountability proceeding. The specific trigger here is instructive. Judge Engoron refused to give Trump the exit he was seeking from the proceeding. Trump wanted the case dismissed. He wanted the legal accountability mechanism to simply go away. When it did not, when the judge made clear that the proceedings would continue and that Trump would have to face the evidence, the physical exit followed. It is almost as if Trump cannot tolerate being in a room where the legal system is refusing to give him what he wants. When the system says no, when it insists on holding him accountable, the response is not engagement with the substance of the case. It is departure. Now layer in the public attacks that accompanied these proceedings. This is where the behavioral record moves from courtroom exits to something broader. During the fraud trial, during the Carroll proceedings, during various other legal confrontations, Trump repeatedly attacked the prosecutors handling the cases. He called them corrupt. He characterized the entire legal apparatus as a political weapon. He described the prosecutors as working for Joe Biden's crew of hacks and thugs. ABC affiliate coverage documented this specific language. These are not the statements of a defendant who believes in the legal process and is confident the process will vindicate him. These are the responses of someone who is publicly attacking the legitimacy of the proceedings rather than engaging with their substance. The rhetoric escalated. The attacks became more personal. The language grew more inflammatory. Calling the cases witch hunts was a standard refrain. Accusing prosecutors of being political operatives became routine. Describing them as Biden's enforcers was a familiar talking point. But here's what makes this pattern particularly significant. These attacks were not just campaign rhetoric or media appearances. They were being delivered while Trump was actively in legal proceedings, while judges were issuing gag orders specifically designed to prevent such attacks, and while the legal consequences of those attacks were becoming increasingly tangible. The gag order dimension adds a specifically self-defeating quality to the documented courtroom behavior. Judges issue gag orders when they determine that a defendant's public statements about witnesses, jurors, court staff, or other participants in a proceeding create a risk of intimidation or prejudice to the fairness of the proceedings. Trump received such orders in multiple cases. He violated them repeatedly. Fines were imposed. Warnings of more severe sanctions were issued. And yet the attacks continued. Consider what that tells us. A defendant who continues to violate gag orders after receiving financial sanctions, knowing that continuation risks more severe sanctions, including possible incarceration, is demonstrating a behavioral impulse that is not being modulated by the consequences it is producing. Whether that represents an inability to regulate rage under stress, or whether it represents a calculated political strategy of martyrdom and base mobilization, the behavioral fact is documented regardless of the interpretation. The attacks continued because the impulse to attack was stronger than the deterrent effect of the sanctions. That is the behavioral record in its starkest form. Now let us shift from the courtroom to the television studio. Because the pattern does not confine itself to legal settings. It extends into the journalistic arena as well. June 2026, NBC's Meet the Press, one of the most prestigious interview platforms in American journalism. Kristen Welker is the anchor, a seasoned journalist known for her sharp questioning and preparation. The interview was already tense. Trump was being pressed on his continued claims about election fraud, claims that had been rejected by courts, election officials, and multiple investigations. Welker was doing what journalists are supposed to do, holding power accountable, asking tough questions, demanding evidence for the claims being made. And then it happened. The question became too pointed. The pressure reached its peak. Trump snapped. He told Welker that she and the network were dishonest. He did not simply express disagreement. He attacked the journalistic institution itself. Then he removed his microphone. Right there on live television. The physical gesture was unmistakable. The microphone removal is the journalistic equivalent of a lawyer's closing argument. It is the moment when participation in the accountability format ends. And then he walked away from the interview. Yahoo News covered it. CTV News covered it. The coverage was immediate and extensive. But here is what made this incident different from the courtroom exits. This was not a legal proceeding where physical presence may or may not be required. This was a live television interview. A sitting president walked out of a live interview mid-answer after tearing off his microphone. The visual was shocking precisely because of what it represented. The accountability interview format had reached a visible limit. When the questions get difficult enough, the interview ends unilaterally. The president simply decides he has had enough and leaves. The trigger attack exit sequence was identical to the courtroom pattern. An adverse moment, the tough question about election fraud. An attack on the accountability actor, Welker and the network are dishonest. And a physical departure from the accountability setting. The consistency across different settings, legal and journalistic, is what transforms these incidents from a collection of isolated moments into a documented behavioral pattern. It is the same sequence repeating with mechanical precision. Pressure, attack, exit. Pressure, attack, exit. Pressure, attack, exit. The mainstream coverage response to the Meet the Press walk-off is itself a documented part of the story. Yahoo News specifically sparked fresh he mentally okay discussion in mainstream coverage. Not fringe commentary, mainstream coverage. Journalists and commentators openly discussing the mental health question in response to a live television walk-off. This reflects the professional judgment of the journalists covering the incident that the behavior warrants that specific discussion. Whether that discussion reaches a clinical conclusion or remains in the realm of observation and political commentary is a question the available documentation does not resolve. But the fact that it is being discussed openly in mainstream coverage is itself a documented part of the second-term political record. Psychologists who spoke to The Independent identified this specific pattern of attacking adversaries with terrible motives and characteristics rather than engaging with the legal merits as consistent with projection and brittle ego under legal pressure. That psychologist commentary is documented. It comes from identified mental health professionals speaking to journalists. It is not clinical diagnosis. It is professional observation about a public figure's documented public behavior. And it is worth noting, as part of the complete picture, while maintaining the caveat, that professional observation to journalists and clinical diagnosis are different things. The distinction is important. We are not asserting clinical conclusions. We are documenting behavioral incidents and noting what credentialed professionals have observed to reporters. The difference between documented behavior and clinical conclusion is the line we are maintaining throughout. The behavior is on the record. The exits are captured on video. The attacks are transcribed. The gag order violations are a matter of court record. Those facts are indisputable. The interpretation of what those facts mean for Trump's mental state, his strategic judgment, his ability to function under pressure, that interpretation belongs to the professionals who have offered their observations and to the journalists who have reported those observations. Now consider the legal self-defeat dimension more carefully. A purely strategic actor who is attacking prosecutors and judges as a calculated political move to mobilize the base and shift news cycles would be expected to stop when the financial and legal costs of those attacks exceeded the political benefits. The documented record shows attacks and violations continuing after fines were imposed and after warnings of more severe sanctions were issued. Either the political benefits of the attacks are being assessed as exceeding the legal cost at each decision point, which would require a very specific strategic calculation, or the behavioral impulse is not being modulated by rational assessment of consequences in the way that a purely strategic actor would modulate it. The psychologists who spoke to The Independent and who identified the pattern as consistent with brittle ego and projection rather than calculated strategy are offering the professional behavioral observation that the second explanation may be more accurate than the first. That is their professional observation. It is not a clinical diagnosis. It is expert commentary on documented public behavior. And it is worth noting in that specific and limited framing, the mainstream coverage of the Meet the Press walk-off generating open is he mentally okay discussion, is itself a documented part of the second-term behavioral record. But here is what makes the pattern even more significant. The trigger attack exit sequence is not confined to the courtroom and the interview studio. It is visible across multiple settings, multiple accountability actors, multiple years. The consistency is what makes it a documented pattern rather than a series of isolated incidents. And patterns are the specific thing that both political accountability, journalism, and behavioral observation are designed to document. Let us look at what the documented storm out and attack pattern means and what it does and does not establish. The first thing to understand is the distinction between the documented settings and what they have in common. The Carroll trial is a civil damages proceeding that produced the massive verdict. The fraud trial is a civil case about business fraud that produced significant financial penalties. The Meet the Press walk-off is a live television interview, 3 different settings, 2 legal proceedings. 1 journalistic accountability setting, all producing the same behavioral sequence, an adverse moment, an attack on the accountability actor, and a physical departure from the accountability setting. The consistency of the sequence across different settings is what makes it a documented pattern, rather than a series of isolated incidents. And patterns are the specific thing that both political accountability, journalism, and behavioral observation are designed to document. The second layer is the legal self-defeat dimension of the gag order violations. A defendant who continues to violate gag orders after receiving financial sanctions, knowing that continuation risks more severe sanctions, including possible incarceration, is demonstrating a behavioral impulse that is not being modulated by the consequences it is producing. The third layer is the press freedom and institutional dimension of the Meet the Press walk-off. Walk-off from a live presidential interview after calling the anchor dishonest is the physical escalation of the same behavioral pattern documented across multiple reporter attack incidents. The attack preceding the exit. The attribution of dishonesty or bad faith to the accountability actor. The physical departure when the accountability pressure becomes most intense. The specific institutional consequence is that it establishes that the accountability interview format has a visible limit. When the questions get difficult enough, the interview ends unilaterally. That knowledge affects how interviewers approach future presidential interviews, how much accountability pressure they apply before the president shuts it down, and how viewers assess the completeness of the information they are getting from presidential interview formats. Now, we must acknowledge the counter-arguments, because fairness demands that we give the complete picture. Trump and his supporters have arguments about all of these documented incidents that deserve acknowledgement. On the courtroom stormouts, they would argue that Trump's departures from civil proceedings were within his legal rights. Attendance at civil proceedings is not required. His exits were legally permissible rather than contempt of court. They would argue that his attacks on prosecutors and judges are protected political speech. The same First Amendment that protects reporters' right to cover him protects his right to characterize legal proceedings as politically motivated. They would argue that the gag order violations represent good faith disagreements about the scope of speech restrictions rather than deliberate defiance of court authority. On the Meet the Press walk-off, they would argue that Welker's questioning was adversarial and unfair, that Trump's characterization of the network as dishonest reflects a legitimate grievance about media bias rather than an inability to handle accountability, and that walking out of an interview he found hostile was a reasonable response. These are real arguments. The right to leave a civil proceeding is legally real. The First Amendment protects his public attacks on prosecutors. The grievance about media bias resonates with many who feel the press is unfair to Trump. These deserve acknowledgement, because acknowledging opposing arguments is what fair documentation requires. But here's what those arguments run into when you apply them to the documented record. The Carroll stormout happened specifically during closing arguments, the moment of maximum accountability in the proceeding, not during a routine phase of the trial. The timing is not coincidental. The fraud trial stormout followed a specific adverse ruling, not a routine procedural moment. The gag order violations continued after financial sanctions, which is not the behavior of a good faith disagreement about speech scope. The Meet the Press walk-off with the microphone removal and the dishonest characterization preceding the exit, follows the trigger attack exit sequence that is consistent across the courtroom and journalistic settings. Whether each individual incident is legally permissible, and most of them are, the behavioral pattern across them is documented and consistent in ways that the individual incident defense does not address. The documented behavioral record is accumulating. The Carroll storm out, the fraud trial exit, the prosecutorial attack pattern, the gag order violations, and the meet the press walk-off each have distinct dimensions worth examining. The Carroll storm out is the most specifically documented of the courtroom exits, and the one whose specific trigger is most clearly established in the public record. The closing arguments were the moment when Carroll's lawyer directly addressed the jury with the argument that Trump persistently lied and acted as if laws do not apply to him. That is the specific thing Trump walked out during. Judge Kaplan's on-record notation, "Mr. Trump just rose and walked out of the courtroom," is the most official documentation of the moment. The audible gasp that reporters describe reflects the specific shock of a defendant in a case where a jury is hearing closing arguments physically departing from the proceeding. The New York civil fraud case, Storm Out, had the judicial ruling as the specific trigger and the shouting match before the exit as the documented context. Courthouse News described Trump storming out after Judge Engoron refused to dismiss the case following Michael Cohen's testimony. The dramatic shouting match between lawyers before Trump stood and left is the documented pre-storm out dynamic, the escalation of tension before the physical departure. The specific trigger, a judge refusing to dismiss, is the moment when the legal accountability mechanism formally declined to give him the exit he was seeking from the proceeding. The storm out is the physical response to a legal system not giving him the outcome he wanted. The pattern across both the Carroll storm out and the fraud trial storm out is the same. A specific adverse legal moment produces a physical departure from the accountability proceeding. That pattern is the behavioral record. The prosecutorial attack language Trump used during these proceedings is documented across ABC affiliate coverage and multiple outlets. Calling the cases witch hunts, calling the prosecutors corrupt, describing them as working for Biden's crew of hacks and thugs. These are not the standard responses of a defendant who believes in the legal process and is confident the process will vindicate him. They are the responses of someone who is publicly attacking the legitimacy of the proceedings rather than engaging with their substance. The Meet the Press June 2026 walk-off is the most recent and most broadly covered of the documented exits. Its June 2026 timing makes it specifically relevant to the second-term behavioral record. The interview was already tense. Trump was being pressed on election lies. Welker's questions produced the snap that she and the network were dishonest, followed by the microphone removal, followed by the physical departure from the interview. The specific significance of the Meet the Press walk-off beyond its dramatic visual is this. A sitting president walking out of a live television interview after ripping off his microphone mid-answer is a president ending his accountability to the journalist and the viewers at the specific moment when the accountability pressure was reaching its highest point. That is the same behavioral dynamic as the courtroom storm outs. Physical departure from the accountability setting at the moment of maximum pressure with a public attack on the person creating the accountability pressure preceding the exit. The mainstream coverage response to the Meet the Press walk-off is itself a documented part of the story. Yahoo News' coverage specifically sparked fresh "is he mentally okay" discussion in mainstream coverage, not fringe commentary. Mainstream coverage. The fact that it is being discussed openly in mainstream coverage is itself a documented part of the second-term political record. So what does all of this add up to? Trump walked out of the E. Jean Carroll damages trial during closing arguments with Judge Kaplan noting it on the record and reporters describing audible gasps. He walked out of the New York civil fraud case after Judge Engoron refused to dismiss following a dramatic shouting match. He repeatedly attacked prosecutors throughout those proceedings, calling it a witch hunt and describing them as Biden's crew of hacks and thugs. He generated gag order violations and financial sanctions that continued despite those sanctions. And on live television, he attacked Kristen Welker as dishonest, removed his microphone, and walked off the Meet the Press set. Each incident is documented by Sky News, Courthouse News, Yahoo News, CTV News, and multiple other outlets. The pattern across them, trigger, attack, exit, is consistent. Psychologists who spoke to The Independent identified the pattern as more consistent with brittle ego under pressure than with calculated legal strategy. That is, professional observation of documented public behavior, not clinical diagnosis. The mainstream coverage of the Meet the Press walk-off generating open, is he mentally okay discussion, is itself a documented part of the second-term behavioral record. The documented storm out and walk-off pattern represents the ceiling of the behavioral record we are tracking. The overnight Truth Social posting binges, the civilization will die Iran threats, the disgraceful characterizations of Supreme Court justices, the quiet piggy insult on Air Force One, and the dozy Don falling asleep pattern are all part of the same accumulated behavioral documentation. Each individual incident gets dismissed as a moment. The pattern across all of them is the second-term behavioral record. And that record is still being written in real time, in settings that cameras are capturing and reporters are documenting every single day. The pattern is unmistakable. Accountability pressure arrives. The response is an attack. The attack is followed by a physical departure. It has happened in courtrooms, it has happened on live television, it has happened repeatedly and consistently. Whether each individual incident is legally permissible or politically defensible is almost beside the point. The behavioral record is documented, the pattern is consistent, and the questions that pattern raises about judgment, control, and capacity will continue to be asked by the journalists documenting the exits and the professionals observing the behavior. The behavioral record is what it is. The exits happened. The attacks happened. The pattern is documented. What it means politically and institutionally is a question that the record itself forces us to confront. Because when a president repeatedly leaves the room when accountability pressure reaches its peak, the question is not just about that president's behavior. It is about what that behavior tells us about how power responds when it is forced to answer for its actions. The answer so far is clear. Pressure produces attack. Attack produces exit. The record is still being written. The pattern continues to hold.